Welcome back, and thanks for choosing History with Hampson for your history needs. Today we will continue our look at America at the turn of the 20th century by considering America's entrance onto the world stage. We will acquire two more territories that will ultimately become the 49th and 50th states and go to war with Spain, and the end of one empire will mark the start of another. It's American Imperialism, Part 1. Remember in the middle part of the 19th century when we talked about the idea of manifest destiny, the idea that America had a right to all of the land from the Atlantic to the Pacific and from Canada to Mexico. Well, Mexico, once we redrew the boundaries after the Mexican War. Once we reached the 20th century, this destiny seemed to be fulfilled, as the Census Bureau declared the frontier had been settled in 1890. Americans would then turn their attention to new frontiers overseas and look for colonies like the Europeans had done for centuries. This process, imperialism, is the policy of extending a nation's authority over other countries by economic, political, or military means. Once a colony, America would become an imperial power in the 20th century for several reasons, including a desire for a strong military. A strong military, and more importantly at the time, a strong navy, would be needed to compete with European countries. Alfred Thayer Mahan argued that industrialization required overseas markets, and in order to reach these markets, the United States needed a merchant marine and a navy. Also, a strong military was needed to protect a prospective empire. There were also economic concerns. As Americans became more and more technologically advanced in the 19th century, American factories and farmers could produce more goods than Americans could possibly buy. American factories also needed raw materials to turn into finished products, and farmers and merchants needed more customers, so Americans would seek opportunities in markets overseas. Also, there was the idea of cultural superiority, the idea that it was the job of Americans and Europeans to lead these uncivilized peoples to the light of civilization. This was what Rudyard Kipling referred to as the white man's burden. If only these savages, as they were portrayed in the images and writings at the time, could live how Americans live, their lives would be better. So American ideas and values with regards to religion, economics, and politics would be exported overseas. This was the civilizing mission. An early example of expansion was the acquisition of Alaska, way up in the northwestern corner of Canada. This was an area rich with plenty of natural resources, especially timber, and more importantly, as America progressed through the 19th and into the 20th century, oil. Alaska was purchased from Russia in 1867 by Secretary of State William Seward for 2 cents an acre, and they bought this territory because of these natural resources. And what at the time was mocked as Seward's folly would become the 49th United State in January 1959. Hawaii was important to American trade in the 19th century and would be even more important politically and economically in the second half of the 19th century. Hawaii was important because it served as a stopping point for American merchants on their way to China and the East Indies. Americans established Christian schools and churches and had good relations with Hawaiians. American-owned Hawaiian sugar plantations traded mostly with the United States and made a lot of money for American corporations. These corporations would bring in workers from China and Japan to a point that by 1900, foreigners and immigrant laborers outnumbered Hawaiians 3-1. There was an increasing American presence in Hawaii. The United States built a naval base at Pearl Harbor in 1887 to serve as a refueling station for American ships. This installation obviously will be more important when we get to the year 1941. American industrial leaders during the time persuaded the Hawaiian king, Kalakaua, to restrict voting rights to only wealthy landowners. But in 1891, Hawaiian Queen Lilikulani wanted to get rid of these voting requirements, wanting Hawaii for Hawaiians. This effort led to the United States settlers overthrowing the Queen and establishing the Republic of Hawaii. This move was led by Sanford Dole. The name Dole should be familiar, maybe from the produce aisle at the grocery store. The Hawaiian Pineapple Company was founded in 1901 by James Dole, cousin of Sanford Dole, who would be the leader of Hawaii after the overthrow. And in 1898, Congress annexed Hawaii, meaning that they took it over, and it would become the 50th United States in 1959. It should also be noted that this annexation made the selling of Dole pineapples much more profitable for the company in the United States. Now we'll turn our attention to Cuba, which is a small island located about 90 miles from the coast of Florida. The relationship between Cuba and the United States in American history is an interesting one. We'll start with Cuba in 1898 as a colony of Spain, which was a fading world power at the time. American corporations had invested millions of dollars in Cuba, and when stories of Spanish atrocities against Cubans came out, like the stories of Spanish putting Cubans in concentration camps, there were increased calls for Cuban independence. Newspapers at the time were competing for readers. The leading publishers of the time were William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, and they used events in Cuba to increase circulation. To do this, they wrote sensational accounts of what was going on in Cuba. This type of journalism was known as yellow journalism, sensational writing that exaggerated events to get more people to read the newspaper. These items made Americans sympathize with the Cuban people and turned many Americans against the Spanish. As Hearst famously said, "You furnish the pictures, and I'll furnish the war." And he and Pulitzer did help furnish a war between the United States and Spain in 1898 as a result of their yellow journalism. When we look at the causes of what will become the Spanish-American War, the first thing we look at is the Delome letter, which was penned by the Spanish ambassador to the United States, Delome. In the letter, which was stolen and subsequently published in many American newspapers, the minister described the American president, William McKinley, as weak. He resigned immediately, but his letter outraged many Americans, and the yellow press used this to sell newspapers and to drive American sentiment against the Spanish. The most important event in the lead-up to the Spanish-American War was the sinking of the USS Maine. President McKinley had sent the American ship to Havana Harbor in 1898, and on February 15th of that year, the USS Maine mysteriously blew up in Havana Harbor, and 260 Americans were killed. At the time, no one knew the cause of the explosion, but many were quick to blame the Spanish, and the American yellow press ran with the story. Hearst offered a $50,000 reward for anyone who could help capture the perpetrators of the sinking of the Maine. His paper, the New York Journal, also showed a hand-drawn image of a Spanish mine under the ship. Remember the Maine became the rallying cry for the supposed Spanish attack on the United States. It's worth noting that investigations have said that the ship's explosion was the result of an accident, not a Spanish mine, like the yellow press claimed. It's also worth noting that on April 20th, 1898, the United States declared war on Spain. The Spanish-American War was fought in the Philippines and Cuba, with the opening battles fought in the Philippines, which was another Spanish colony. The United States' victory at Manila Bay helped get the Spanish out of the Philippines and led the Filipinos to believe that independence was right around the corner. We'll have more to say on this next time. The United States Army was not well trained and equipped in 1898. Teddy Roosevelt, before he was president, was one of the heroes of the war as a leader of a volunteer cavalry unit, the Rough Riders, for his actions at San Juan Hill. The fighting lasted less than 15 weeks, and Secretary of State John Hay called it a splendid little war. Many more Americans died from disease than died in combat in the Spanish-American War, and the consequences of this splendid little war were major for American foreign policy. Let's close the show by looking at the Treaty of Paris and the results of the Spanish-American War. The Treaty of Paris in 1898 brought the war to an end. The results included the end of Spain as a world power and the birth of the United States as a major world power. Also, Cuba was freed, but still under the influence of the United States, where they would remain until the rise of Fidel Castro in 1959. As a result of the war, the United States gained colonies. The Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico would now be American territories. The United States could now claim the mantle of imperial power. Spain received $20 million for the Philippines. The war leads to a debate in the United States over imperialism. Was imperialism right or was it wrong? Did imperialism violate the ideals of the Declaration of Independence? President McKinley said there was nothing left for us to do but to take them all and to educate the Filipinos and uplift and Christianize them. Booker T. Washington argued that Americans should work on race problems at home before tackling issues elsewhere, and Samuel Gompers worried that Filipino immigrants would come to America and compete for jobs. One thing was certain: American foreign policy would not be the same. We'll look at this debate a little more next time, as well as another war, a South American canal, and American foreign policy in Latin America and China. And until then, good night, Albuquerque.